80,000 men marched into the Apulian dust, the physical embodiment of an invincible state. In the late summer of 216 BC, the Roman Republic possessed a military machine defined by forward momentum, brute force, and an absolute refusal to yield. To stand before the legions was to face a tidal wave of bronze and iron, a force that had systematically crushed rival powers across the Italian peninsula. Yet within a matter of hours, this entire mechanism of conquest would be utterly dismantled, leaving a trail of blood that would forever alter the trajectory of human civilization. The impending slaughter would shatter the illusion of Roman invulnerability and force a radical reinvention of warfare itself. The approaching crisis was born of a rigid, uncompromising doctrine. Roman military strategy relied heavily on overwhelming numerical superiority and a straightforward crushing center assault. When a Carthaginian general named Hannibal crossed the Alps and began ravaging Italian soil, the Senate responded exactly as their traditions dictated. They amassed the largest army in their history, appointing 2 consuls to march south and crush the invader in one decisive, glorious, pitched battle. Compromise was considered weakness. Attrition was deemed un-Roman. They sought a swift, brutal conclusion, entirely blind to the reality that their predictability was the exact weapon their enemy intended to use against them. On the flat, unforgiving plains near a small village called Cannae, the trap was meticulously laid. Hannibal deployed his forces in a convex crescent, deliberately placing his weakest Celtic and Iberian infantry in the center, directly in the path of the Roman juggernaut. He anchored his flanks with elite, battle-hardened African infantry and a vastly superior cavalry force. As the Roman legions predictably surged forward, driving deep into the yielding Carthaginian center, they believed they were executing a textbook victory. The sheer mass of the Roman advance compressed their own ranks, stripping away their mobility and blinding them to the jaws closing around them. The realization of their doom arrived not with a sudden shock, but with a horrifying, suffocating compression. The Carthaginian center bowed but did not break, while the elite African infantry pivoted inward, striking the exposed Roman flanks. Simultaneously, Hannibal's victorious cavalry returned to seal the rear. The double envelopment was complete. Trapped in a shrinking pocket, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were packed so tightly they could not raise their swords. The ensuing hours were not a battle, but a methodical, mechanized butchery. The sun set on an army annihilated, leaving an estimated 50,000 Romans dead in the dirt. The echoes of that ancient conflict still resonated through the streets of Rome as the catastrophic news arrived. The demographic collapse was unprecedented, with a staggering percentage of the Republic's military-aged men, along with 80 senators and a sitting consul, wiped out in a single afternoon. Panic gripped the city. The unthinkable had occurred, and the road to Rome lay wide open. Investigating the immediate aftermath reveals a society teetering on the edge of total psychological and political disintegration. The gods seem to have abandoned them, and the traditional pillars of Roman military might lay shattered in the south. Any other ancient power would have sued for peace. The accepted rules of warfare dictated that such a catastrophic military defeat signaled the end of a conflict, necessitating immediate surrender to preserve whatever remained of the state. Hannibal himself waited for the Roman emissaries, fully expecting the Republic to capitulate. Had they done so, Carthage would have cemented its dominance over the Mediterranean, and the Roman Empire, as history knows, it would never have existed. Instead, as the historian Livy recorded, regarding the Roman spirit, they were never so dangerous as when they seemed to be entirely destroyed. The Senate outlawed public mourning, refused to ransom prisoners, and made a decision that defied all geopolitical logic. They chose to fight on. Survival demanded an agonizing paradigm shift, a complete rejection of the aggressive doctrine that had defined their civilization. The Republic turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man who understood that attempting another decisive battle against Hannibal was collective suicide. He instituted what would become known as the Fabian strategy. This doctrine prioritized a war of attrition, deliberately avoiding pitched battles in favor of small-scale skirmishes, disrupting enemy supply lines, and shadowing the Carthaginian army from high ground where their cavalry was useless. It was a strategy of delay, of bleeding the enemy slowly, and it was deeply unpopular. This strategic pivot fundamentally altered the dynamics of the Second Punic War. By denying Hannibal the decisive victories he needed to fracture Rome's alliances in Italy, the Fabian strategy bought the Republic its most precious resource, time. It was a brutal, unglamorous approach that frustrated Roman politicians who demanded immediate vengeance. Yet across the broader theater of the Mediterranean, this delay allowed Rome to rebuild its forces, secure its loyal territories, and slowly suffocate the Carthaginian expeditionary force. The geopolitical landscape froze, locked in a grueling stalemate that tested the absolute limits of Roman endurance. On the ground, the implementation of this attrition warfare forced a rapid evolution in tactical execution. Roman commanders learned to operate independently, launching coordinated strikes against Carthaginian foraging parties and isolating detached units. The rigid monolithic legion began to fragment into more flexible autonomous bands capable of striking and fading into the landscape. Logistics became the primary weapon of war. By scorching the earth and securing walled cities, the Romans turned the Italian countryside into a hostile, barren wasteland for the invaders, forcing Hannibal into a constant, exhausting search for sustenance. The military machine itself was undergoing a profound structural metamorphosis. The traditional reliance on a heavy, forward-pressing infantry block gave way to a deeper appreciation for the maniple system, a tactical formation which allowed smaller units to maneuver independently over rough terrain. This flexibility was born directly from the trauma of 216 BC. The realization that mass alone could be a fatal vulnerability led to an emphasis on mobility, reserve deployment, and flank protection. The Roman army was learning to bend without breaking, slowly absorbing the tactical genius of the man who had nearly destroyed them. The ultimate synthesis of these brutal lessons would be embodied in a young survivor of the Apulian slaughter. Scipio Africanus had been present at the disaster, witnessing firsthand the devastating effectiveness of the double envelopment and the crucial role of cavalry dominance. Unlike the older generation of commanders who sought only to avoid Hannibal, Scipio studied him. He internalized the Carthaginians' mastery of psychology, deception, and maneuver warfare. This young visionary represented a new breed of Roman leader, one who understood that survival required not just endurance, but the complete appropriation of the enemy's lethal innovation. The strategic lessons from that decisive campaign never faded from Scipio's mind as he engineered a bold new offensive. He recognized that the Fabian strategy could save Rome, but it could not win the war. To break the stalemate, Rome had to project power and strike at the economic heart of the Carthaginian Empire. Overcoming intense political opposition, Scipio secured command of the Roman forces in Spain, Carthage's primary source of wealth and manpower. This was a massive strategic gamble, shifting the center of gravity away from the Italian peninsula and forcing the enemy onto the defensive. In Spain, the Roman legions demonstrated a terrifying new proficiency. At the Battle of Ilipa, Scipio executed a complex tactical maneuver that mirrored the brilliance of his nemesis. He deliberately weakened his center, placing his elite Roman legionaries on the wings, and executed a reverse envelopment that crushed the Carthaginian flank. Furthermore, he systematically addressed Rome's greatest weakness by recruiting and integrating superior Numidian cavalry into his forces. The Roman army had evolved from a blunt instrument of trauma into a highly sophisticated, multidimensional force, capable of executing complex, coordinated maneuvers on a massive scale. The success of this adapted doctrine shattered Carthaginian hegemony in Iberia, With Spain firmly under Roman control, the flow of silver and mercenaries to Hannibal's army in Italy was permanently severed. The balance of power in the western Mediterranean violently shifted. Rome was no longer merely surviving a catastrophic invasion. It was actively dismantling the geopolitical foundations of its greatest rival. The Republic had weaponized its own trauma, transforming a localized defense into a relentless, continent-spanning offensive that isolated the Carthaginian forces still occupying southern Italy. With the momentum irrevocably altered, the Roman Senate authorized the ultimate strategic escalation. Scipio proposed taking the war directly to the shores of Africa, a move designed to force the Carthaginian Senate to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend his homeland. It was a masterpiece of strategic judo, using Carthage's own existential vulnerability to resolve the Italian crisis. By landing an expeditionary force in North Africa, Rome seized the absolute initiative, dictating the time, place, and terms of the final confrontation. The hunter had officially become the hunted. The climax of this decades-long struggle materialized on the dusty plains of Zama. Here, Scipio faced Hannibal in a final definitive clash of military doctrines. When Hannibal deployed his terrifying war elephants to shatter the Roman lines, Scipio's highly disciplined troops simply opened lanes in their formations, allowing the massive beasts to pass through harmlessly before neutralizing them. The battle then devolved into a brutal infantry grind until Scipio's newly acquired Numidian cavalry returned from driving off the Carthaginian horsemen, striking Hannibal's veterans in the rear. The ghost of the Apulian disaster had been exorcised. The defeat of Hannibal at Zama marked the absolute end of Carthage as a Mediterranean superpower. The resulting peace treaty was draconian, stripping Carthage of its overseas territories, its war fleet, and its right to wage war without Roman permission. The immediate consequence was the undisputed elevation of the Roman Republic to the premier power of the ancient world. The existential threat that had nearly erased them from history was extinguished, leaving behind a battle-hardened state possessing a military apparatus of unmatched sophistication and lethal efficiency. The enduring legacy of this conflict extended far beyond the subjugation of a single rival. The catastrophic loss at Cannae had acted as a brutal evolutionary filter. It forced the Roman military to abandon its rigid reliance on brute force and embrace tactical flexibility, combined arms, and strategic patience. The Fabian strategy proved that a nation could survive against a superior tactical genius through sheer resilience and logistical warfare. This newly forged doctrine became the bedrock upon which the Roman Empire would be built, a blueprint for conquering the known world. Consequently, the Mediterranean Sea transformed into a Roman lake. The structural shift in global power dynamics was absolute and irreversible. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East and the tribal confederations of the West would soon face legions that had been tempered in the fires of near annihilation, because Rome had survived the absolute worst that ancient warfare could inflict. Subsequent adversaries found themselves facing an entity that viewed setbacks not as defeats but as temporary logistical delays. The geopolitical map of antiquity was entirely redrawn by a state that refused to die. This relentless drive toward military perfection spurred continuous innovation over the following centuries. The lessons learned from the Carthaginian cavalry led to the permanent integration of diverse auxiliary forces within the Roman military structure. The necessity of independent maneuverability birthed the cohort system, further refining the legion into a modular, highly adaptable killing machine. The professionalization of the Roman soldier, transitioning from a citizen militia to a standing army, was fundamentally rooted in the realization that the defense of the Republic required full-time, highly trained practitioners of violence, capable of executing complex strategic vision. It is a chilling exercise to consider the fragility of historical outcomes. Had the Roman Senate surrendered after the slaughter, The concepts of Roman law, engineering, and governance that shaped Western civilization would have been strangled in their infancy. Carthage, a mercantile empire focused on maritime trade rather than territorial assimilation, would have steered human history down a vastly different course. The survival of the Republic hinged entirely on its singular, terrifying capacity to absorb unimaginable trauma and channel it into a ruthless, systematic overhaul of its own strategic identity. Eras shifted not merely because an army was destroyed, but because of how a civilization responded to the abyss. The Battle of Cannae remains history's greatest masterpiece of tactical annihilation, studied by military commanders from Napoleon to modern generals. Yet its ultimate historical significance lies in its profound unintended consequence. By inflicting such a perfect, devastating defeat, Hannibal inadvertently forged the instrument of his own destruction. He taught Rome how to fight, how to adapt, and how to conquer, ensuring that the ashes of his greatest victory would ultimately fertilize the rise of an eternal empire.